I know almost all the presenters, and I know a lot of people that are in the audience as well. But for those that don't know me, I've had this interest in applying technology and data to elite sports since I was a kid. And one of the drivers for that, and there's been a lot of them, but one of the drivers was realizing that there were really smart people in physiology and in biomechanics and in science that was related to sport doing smart things. So smart people doing smart things in lab environments. And then there was sport, and they were completely unrelated. The things that the smart physiologists were doing really wasn't transferring into elite sport, especially pro sports, more so in the Olympic sports, but definitely not in pro sports. And I could tell that there was a whole lot of value in being able to have one leg firmly planted in academics, in clinical medicine, in science, and the other firmly planted inside sport, really like deep inside sport. And that's been my my plan and now my path for a couple decades now. And it's been an amazing road, and it's not always an easy thing to be in academics and in science and have a love for data and have a place in sport. But it's gotten a whole lot easier recently. You know, in the last half decade or even a decade, there's really an acceptance and an interest in the space, and now I feel like we can do almost anything we want. So it's really it's a super exciting time right now. I want to take you guys in to one area that we found to be the most valuable. When we started this, we used all types of technology to measure athletes. First in Olympic sports, and then in the NFL with the New England Patriots, and then in Major League Baseball, where I was first director of sports science, and now in the NBA and moving into pro soccer. We've used lots of different technologies to measure athletes, but the area that we found the highest value, we've doubled down on, and I want to take you inside that space right now. And it's all related to how athletes move. It's motion capture environments. It's studying granular movement properties of athletes. And I really wish this wasn't the area that was so valuable, because it's for a lot of reasons. But the main one is it's really hard. It's still super labor intensive to get all this granular data, to get really detailed data on how the body's moving, when it's landing, when it's jumping, when it's cutting. It still takes significant skilled data processing to extract all this data. You know, it's not like putting a phone in your pocket or strapping an inertial sensor on. But the value we get from this type of data is so valuable that we've continued to put resources in and really doubled down. And I asked our lead engineer to do a little back of the napkin on this, and he said he thought that we devoted about 45,000 hours of skilled data processing to extracting data. So we assess an athlete, and then we have to extract the data through data processing, and then we have columns and rows of data, and then it gets really interesting. So I'm gonna skip the middle part for you guys. I'm gonna show you a little bit about what these assessments look like that we've done in professional sport, and then more interestingly, some of the insights we're starting to peel out of that. And by far, this is the most interesting time in my space, in my world, because we have these giant data sets now in the NBA and the NFL, in Major League Baseball, and growing in elite soccer, in world football. And we have now giant data sets that we can start asking questions of. And when we started, there was no data context. So if we assessed an athlete, that assessment would just kind of sit in space. We didn't know what an acceptable peak ground force was for an NBA player landing from a maximal jump. We just didn't know. So we could measure it, but it didn't really mean anything. And now it just blooms. It has all this data context that we can look at to create value. And what we spend all our time doing now is connecting these patterns of movement to good and bad outcomes. And if there's one thing you take from this presentation, just one thing, please let it be this: the way we move, the way we land, the way we jump, the way we cut, has huge implications in what happens to our body. How we move has huge implications in what happens to our body, both with respect to risk, with respect to chronic and acute injury, but also with respect to, in the case of athletes, competitive advantages. And we spend a lot of time teasing out let's say, call it the Newtonian physics behind competitive advantages. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. So first off, I just want to show you what this looks like. So we get these pro athletes in a lab environment, and generally they're dotted up. We've almost finished. We've been working on this markerless motion capture for almost 4 years now. We're pretty much at a place where it's seamless. So we're starting to install that in some protein labs. But we have these athletes just be athletes. Okay, they're jumping, they're cutting. We're measuring vertical forces, lateral forces, which are these tracings. And more importantly than the forces that are creating out of the ground, more importantly than that is how are their bodies moving? How do they create those forces? You know, if an athlete jumps 38 inches, where's that force coming from? Is that a system that can survive long term? Is there too much force going through one leg, through one joint? And when there is, then we can predictably estimate injury risk to these joints. And we can do that because we have these big data sets to draw on. So we get these athletes in a lab environment, and they're just trying to be athletes, and we're measuring with excruciating detail how they move. I just want to throw this slide in quickly. It's easy to capture data now. There's lots of different technologies that let us capture data. It's much, much, much harder to set up these closed loop processes where you capture data, you have some value estimation of that data, meaning that data takes on good and bad values. It either creates advantages or disadvantages for the athlete. And then you take that data and you turn it into a prescription. And in our case, it's how do we build better athletes? How do we train these athletes more precisely? But it also feeds into scouting, you know, predicting which athletes will be the best at this next level based on this real granular physics behind movement. It translates into salary extensions and lots of other areas. So taking this data, have some value judgment of data, prescribing or changing your actions based on that data, and then reassessing hopefully to see if you created better outcomes. Always having checks and balances to see if you're actually creating value from these closed loop processes. So as I said, these closed loop processes are very difficult to set up, and rarely do I see this done well in pro sports. Mostly we're just at the level of there's some technology, we can collect some data, and let's start doing that. Teams are starting to get better in this space, but we're still at maybe step 2 of a 10-step process. It's going to get much better. So I said we have all this data now, and so we get to start asking questions of it. And then I'm going to give you an example of a project we just finished right now, looking at knee injuries. This happened to be in NBA athletes, and you know, there's lots of research showing that there are mechanics that lead to increased risk of acute injury. Certainly, valgus loading, where your knee goes in. Most people know about this. That's not a good thing. If you cut and land and your knees are banging against each other, it's not a good thing. But almost all the research has been done on 14-year-old girl soccer players or firemen or just college students. The data that's being used to drive these research projects isn't based on the athletes that we're working with and that I think a lot of you guys are working with. And so to really get insight there, you have to go collect data in those environments, in those populations. And when we do, what we see is that there's some overlap with the published research looking at, say, injuries in 14-year-old girl soccer players. But there's also distinctions. It's not the same. These aren't perfect overlaps. These are really unique athletes that get to keep playing this sport. And by setting up what is really a large-scale clinical research arm, but also being deeply embedded in sport, we're able to do both of those. And that's, I think if you wanted to understand P3, that's the right way to look at it. As a large-scale clinical research lab, but deeply embedded in pro sports. So we work with dozens of teams and have many hundreds of athletes that come directly to our facilities. In the NBA, where we do a lot of work right now, almost 60% of active players have been through one of our facilities. So if there's an injury in the NBA, there's almost a 2/3 chance that it's one of our athletes. And so every time there's an injury, we get to get smarter. If there's a bad outcome, we get to get smarter. And that's a good environment to live in. So even if something bad happens, we get to raise the bar in some area. So looking at knee injuries have been studied a bunch for both chronic and acute risks, but not in NBA athletes. So do knee injuries matter? This is an example from this summer of why they matter. This is Zion Williamson, and we were assessing him. I guess we were assessing him out at the Olympic Training Center. We had a lab set up out there, and we've assessed Zion a bunch of times as a youngster, and he's an amazing athlete. Zion actually creates more raw force when he jumps than any other athlete we've ever assessed. If we drop him off a 18-inch box and have him jump as high as he can, he creates more force than any NFL player we've ever assessed, any thrower, Olympic thrower. He is a force beast. He literally pushes harder against the earth when he jumps than any other athlete we've ever assessed. So he's a really, really rare athlete. And he's also, he's also as hyped as any athlete coming in the NBA since LeBron, maybe even including LeBron. And he couldn't start the season because he had a knee injury. And these are giant losses. They're losses to Zion, obviously, losses to his team, losses to the league, and even cultural losses to all of us, because we all want to see this incredible athlete do what he does. And we have all this data on Zion when he's perfectly healthy. And we use that data to try to keep him healthy. But if he ever gets hurt, we can use it to put him back together again, too. So these things matter. We need to try to protect these rare resources. I'll let you watch him jump one more time. He's 283 pounds here. And, he jumps pretty well. So in this project on knee injuries, we took this approach that both univariate and multivariate classification analysis can be used to identify biomechanical patterns possessed by athletes predisposed to traumatic knee injuries. So essentially, we use traditional medical models looking at single variable correlations, but also a machine learning model where we eventually feed all this data into the machine. It trains itself based on our data, and then it tests itself against populations of NBA players that it's carved out to see how accurate it is at predicting injury. And then for this study, we looked at ACLs, MCLs, and big meniscus injuries requiring surgery. We had almost 500 NBA athletes in this study. So these are 500 NBA athletes that have been to our facilities that we have super granular data on. And it's a big data set. If you look in this space in motion capture and 3D motion capture and risk of injury, usually you'll see ends of like 24. You'll see small ends. And they're never on these type of athletes. I think this is probably the biggest motion capture, 3D motion capture data study that I've seen looking and correlating with knee injury risk, but certainly the only one on professional athletes. And again, we do this by creating value for the athletes. And so they want to show up and be assessed. And so what we want to know is, are there significant biomechanical correlates? And if so, if we use machine learning to design an algorithm to predict knee injury, is it any good? Does it work? So using a univariate model, what we see are there are a number of significant correlations. And generally, the t-test and effect size agree with logistical regression as to what some of those variables are. So for instance, translation. If you have significant translation, and translation is the rotation across the foot when you land. So as an NBA player, when you land, if you land inverted with your feet kind of facing each other and then roll a whole lot to the medial aspect of your foot, That's big translation. So it's basically looking at rotation across the foot and ankle. And of all the single variables, that was the one that was most highly predictive for acute knee injury, with a p-value of 0.009. So it was significantly correlated, way beyond what we think of as statistical significance, like an order of magnitude beyond. Other things that correlated included things like change in delta femoral rotation. They're mostly rotational components. Delta femoral rotation, that's the amount of rotation across your femur when you land. If you land, and by the way, you know, this will be generalizable to some degree to other athletes beyond just NBA players. And that's what we find over and over when we do these studies. They do the study in the NFL. There's going to be a lot of correlation, but it's a little bit different. And it's a lot more different than it is to 14-year-old girl soccer players, but it's a little bit different NBA to NFL. But there's always significant crossover. So the second strongest variable or correlate was delta femoral rotation, amount of rotation across your femur, and then peak knee flexion. That's basically saying that if you don't flex a lot when you land, it increases your risk if you don't absorb those forces. Delta relative rotation, that's your femur rotates in and your tibia rotates out. Every time we look at this looks really, really dangerous. And so I don't want to go too much deeper here, but because we could spend all this time on this. I actually just presented this stuff out at Ground Rounds out at Harvard, and we went deep on it. But here I just want to give you like a little taste of it. And what you should take away is that there are significant correlations between how you land, how you move, and your risk of knee injury. When we took this a step further, when we designed an algorithm using machine learning to predict knee injury, and this is showing this K-fold assessment. I don't know, some of you guys will know K-fold. We don't need to go into it right now, but just know that it's a way of decreasing sampling error and of amplifying the power, the data power of a project. If you don't have a big data set, it's a really useful tool. This is a pretty big data set, but we use K-fold in this, and what it showed us, and what this is showing is this area under the curve predicting risk of knee injury, whereby if we predicted an athlete had a risk of knee injury in the off season when we assessed them, there was a 70% chance that in the very next season, this athlete had a significant knee injury. So if we assess a player in the off season and we say he's at high risk for knee injury and we drew him underneath this curve, there was a 70% chance that in the next season, that athlete had a significant traumatic knee injury. That's a strong correlation. 0.7 area under the curve. You know, it starts getting towards holy grail type stuff. And I think that this is, the reason this stuff hasn't been exposed so much is partly what I said before. It's really hard to collect all this really detailed 3D motion capture data. It's also hard to get all these athletes, to think that in the NBA we have almost 2/3 of the league and giant data sets in these other pro sports too. So, we had to get lucky and work hard to get these big data sets. But it's amazing to think about the power of those types of insights. If you're getting ready to extend a player for 4 years and that he's high risk for a knee injury and that there's a 70% chance in the very next season this player is going to have a traumatic knee injury, then that has to be taken into account. You have to be looking at that card as an organization in the future. And if you're an athlete, you're also looking at that card and you're trying to reduce those risks because most of these are modifiable risk factors. So this is just a small example of the power of machine learning in our space. This was another thing that fell out of this, and I want to highlight it just for these bottom variables. These bottom 4 variables are the 4 variables that were most significant in the algorithm that the computer drew up to predict risk of knee injury. So translation was still the strongest variable, the most weighted variable for risk of knee injury in this machine learning model. But interestingly, mass, which wasn't a factor, it wasn't a significant correlate when we looked at traditional medical models. Mass moved up to the 3rd most significant, the most weighted risk factor for acute knee injury using a machine learning model. And I show you this because, at least for me, it was super profound, showing the power of machine learning in our space. The way the body works biomechanically is that all these movements are interrelated. They don't really like to live in these static columns and rows that we put them in. We need analytical tools that really bring to life the interrelated properties of these different biomechanical movements. So, a way to think about it is if you roll a lot, if you have a lot of translation when you hit the ground, you roll your foot a lot, you tend to also externally rotate your tibia. And if you do that, you tend to internally rotate your femur. And if you do that across your hip, you tend to, and so these things just get passed right down the line. And the reason mass didn't show up as a significant risk factor in a traditional medical model is that if you have good mechanics, if you have clean mechanics, and you're really heavy, you're not at increased risk. That's what the data shows us. But mass is a significant modifier of all these other risk factors for acute knee injury. And so mass by itself isn't that risky. But if you have big translation, or you have internal rotation of your femur when you land, and you're really heavy, like 283 pounds, like Zion, then it's super dangerous. Okay? Then it's super dangerous. And that type of information gets lost in these traditional single variable correlations that we normally do in medicine. And they really come to life when we use machine learning and AI models. Okay, this is Zach Levine. This is a skeletal motion capture recreation of him. Okay, you get it. He's a crazy athlete. He's one of the best single leg jumpers we've ever assessed, and just all around amazing athlete. This is an assessment of Zach looking at cumulative vertical ability versus cumulative lateral ability compared to other NBA players that we assessed in the same year. This is Zach Levine up here. This is where you want to live. This is basically saying he's almost off the charts as a vertical performer. We only got half of him on here at the 100th percentile, and he's deep far to the right as a lateral performer. That's an amazing place to live. That's an incredible system. So even amongst these other freak athletes in the NBA, this player is pretty unusual. And we've been assessing Zach and working with Zach since he was relatively young. And when we assess him, what we see is that he has risk to his left knee. These are actually extracted from previous assessments on Zach. So he has this cumulative risk to his left knee. And these are some of the reasons why he had big translation across the foot that we talked about, relative rotation. The femur goes one way, tibia goes the other way, hip decel, femoral rotation. So he does some of these things that put him at really high risk. He's in almost single digits, which is where you don't want to live. So we were worried about his left knee. Unfortunately, he went out and he tore his left knee, had an ACL injury on his left knee. And it wasn't completely unexpected. We were trying to correct these things, but he was off trying to be an NBA athlete as well. And the team let him sit out for 8 months. They worked hard. He's playing with the Chicago Bulls at the time, and they're getting ready to bring him back. And we're hearing that he's jumping higher than he's ever jumped. And he looks amazing. He put on 15 pounds and he's jumping higher than he'd ever jumped. And 8 months out, the Bulls are getting ready to bring him back. And I had a flashback to the time that we really started engaging in the NBA. And I heard a story about this hyper athletic guard for the Bulls tearing his ACL. He's getting ready to come back. He's jumping 3 inches higher. And that was Derrick Rose. And within a couple weeks of him coming back, he tore meniscus and a routine plate on his opposite knee because he had these what has to be compensation patterns. We didn't assess him then. We've assessed him a lot of times since then, and he's a beautiful human being, and he's going on to have a really nice career. But that was really a tragedy that not only that he had this initial injury, but then he had the second injury, which has been the one that's been more detrimental. So the question is, this 23-year-old hyper athletic guard, does he move like he used to move, or is he moving in a way that's going to put other parts of his body at risk? And when we assessed him, what we found that after 8 months is not only was his left knee at risk like it was before, but so was his right. And so now he's increased his risk on his right side and has at least as much risk on the left, if not more. And the Bulls, to their credit, they kept him out. They let him sit out for another 6 weeks, and then they sent him back to us. They worked on the things that we saw. We reassessed him, and this is him on the right after that 6 weeks of sitting out, and now he's got 0 red on his body. We're saying he's way less at risk than he was before, and we're predicting great things for this kid. And he's done amazingly well since he's come back. And so whenever we do this type of assessment, we think everybody's going to do this in the future. Like every team at the professional level needs to have this data working for them. And I trust that they will in the very near future. All right, I want to show you, this is just when he came back, his the vertical performance tends to come back before lateral. And so this is demonstrating this. I want to show you an example. I'm going to give you one more example from our space. And this is an example of the second order performance metrics. And I'm going to try to kind of zip through this. But
Marcus, I'm just going to hop on and give you just a quick 2-minute warning.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'm going to just give you this, and then we'll wrap it. But this is James Harden's assessment. When we assess James Harden, he's basically average in almost any traditional metric. And to the left, you can see this. He's basically at the 50th percentile with respect to most all of these metrics. But then he has these giant peaks, and these peaks are at the 99th percentile, 99.9 percentile. And it's amazing to look out at the sea of average and see these giant peaks. And these peaks are all turned out all to be related to his braking system, how well James stops. And as a data scientist, that's amazing. You know, that's incredible for all of us. We got excited. And it turns out that James' cumulative braking system is the best we've ever assessed in basketball. And he's sculpted a game around that system. So James's game is evolved around his world-class ability to break. That's the one thing he does better than anybody else who plays the game. Nobody can stop with him, and they can know it's coming, but they can't keep up with them. And that's just a small example of how there really are physics behind these games. And by identifying these superpowers like that, it lets us predict when we say have a 15-year-old player that's coming over from Europe to see us, as we did. That we assess when he's 15, 16, 17, and now he's going in the NBA as an 18-year-old. And everyone's trying to understand if this player who's been playing in Europe the last 4 years is athletic enough to be an NBA player. And we're sitting on all this data that shows us that this is James on the red in the spider graph, and this is Luka Doncic in the blue. And it's showing that as an 18-year-old, his braking system was at the 95th percentile of NBA players. So he stopped better than 19 out of 20 players as an 18-year-old. And so we knew he had an absolute superpower that would play in the NBA. And he's gone on to have an absolutely historic start to his career. But these are the kind of games that we're in. We're involved in all the time, whether we're working with teams or we're just trying to serve the athlete and the agent. Understanding motion, using big data solutions, analytical tools that have just come into our world over the last 3 or 4 years in a real way. This AI and machine learning is giving us just incredible insights into these games. This is the last piece I'm going to give you, and then we'll leave it. But this is something that I'm super excited about, and this is essentially taking all of this data that we generate, feeding it in the machine, and letting the machine find, through principal component analysis, find clusters of athletes that move in similar ways, and they may look completely different, but what we find are these clusters tend to have characteristics that are pretty similar. You know, they're players that'll have a couple good years in the league, look great, but then get injured. There are players that are incredibly athletic and go on to have great careers. And then there's this cluster we call the kinematic movers. And CJ McCollum is our classic kinematic movers. But these are athletes that are completely under the radar most of the time. They don't wow you with anything, but everything works right. They have an answer for every job. Every situation. And so just a small look into cluster analysis and how we're taking these big data sets and making them functional for teams and for players. All right, y'all. I know I went over a little bit. Hopefully that was an interesting seed inside our world just for a moment. And again, I want to thank Sport Techie for rising to the occasion during this pandemic. And I want to thank all of you guys for joining and committing some of your time to me this afternoon. So thank you so much.